Our first speaker is going to be Nina Teicholz, and she is going to be speaking on the science on keto and diabetes. So let's have a warm welcome for Nina.
So I don't know how many of you know, I wrote a book, and the rabbit hole that I really went down was about saturated fat. Good fat, bad fat, low fat, non-fat, the whole story about fat that we seem to have gotten just completely upside down and backwards, and that's what I wrote my book about. So I just want to get a sense of what people think about saturated fat out here. It's the kind of fat that you find in meat and butter and cheese, but also coconut oil, palm oil. How many people here think that saturated fat causes heart disease? Oh, well, so I'm just going to leave now. How many people think that saturated fat causes obesity? Pretty good. How many people think that saturated fat elevates your performance such that you do never procrastinate anymore? Well, I can tell you, I was up till 2 a.m. doing this presentation, getting it ready, so you're just going to have to be patient with me if something goes wrong, because I still procrastinate. But I also want to say, for this presentation, I know a lot of you already really know the basics of this story about saturated fat and Ansel Keys and the 7-country study, and I am going to cover some of those basics, but I'm also going into some nitty-gritty gritty detail for some insider stuff for people who sort of, have graduated to the next level. So hopefully there'll be something in here for everyone, and you can look up from your iPhones when you hear the interesting stuff. If you're bored with the basics, and I'm sure Mr. Bass Guy will start playing his bass to let me know if I'm getting too boring. Okay, so let's see. My disclosure: I do not receive any industry support of any kind, despite various attempts to say that I work for the meat industry. I don't receive any industry support from any industry group for anything at all. And I don't sell anything other than my book, so I'm not a saturated fat magnate. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is just to make it clear about sort of saturated fat versus the low-fat diet, right? I think that the low-fat diet, the idea that all fats were bad for health, was really started by the American Heart Association in 1970 and then adopted by our government, and so everybody was told to go on a low-fat diet. That idea, we are actually backing out of the low-fat diet now. And this is a piece I wrote for the Wall Street Journal, and Alice Lichtenstein is a member of the U.S. Dietary Guideline Committee, which is the top expert body in the land, saying, well, low-fat diet, this is from 2015 when she said, low-fat diets really are not a good idea. And if you go and if you listen to the proceedings of that committee when it met in Washington, D.C., they say in passing, oh, well, there's no low-fat diet recommendation anymore, which is incredible. I told my husband this, and he's like, that is a huge headline. He says, you don't realize that most people don't know. Like, the low-fat diet is over. It is officially over. It's a little more complicated than that because when they hand out their formularies and they when the government and everybody who gets their information from the government hands out their formularies, they're still telling people to eat over 50% of their calories as carbohydrates. But they don't use the word low fat anymore. So it's like a half victory. It's like a victory in a Kafka-esque universe. But low-fat diets really are not there, and they have been there. You can see, in the tip of the pyramid, we all know so well and love so dearly, that fats and oils and sweets have long been up in that tip there ever since 1980. This is what our government has told us. This is my complex slide to help you understand when I talk about nutrition, what informs my understanding is really how powerful these dietary guidelines are, and that's why I talk about them. And it shows you the dietary guidelines, they filter down in various ways to really, you don't go to a .gov website to find out about your health. Nobody searches that. But they inform, they teach they go down through the professional healthcare associations, the doctors, the nurses, the diabetes educators, the nutritionists and dietitians, and then that all comes down. So each and every healthcare professional working with the public, it's basically just channeling the dietary guidelines. And they control what the military eats, what goes into school lunches, and the whole food supply has changed because of the dietary guideline. That's why we have lean meat that was invented to respond to the dietary guidelines. So you think the dietary guidelines don't affect you, but they reach into every corner of American life, and that's why I talk about them, and that's why I care about them. I think they're the most. Although I believe in this bottom-up change, and I believe it's incredibly powerful, the kind of rigidities that are imposed above by these guidelines are really significant. And there they are again, they're issued every 5 years, and there again, 1995, they're saying choose a diet low in fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. But in 2000, okay, this is almost 20 years ago now, in 2000, there's no mention of total fat. See, it says here under the I don't know if I have a pointer. The yellow button. Yes. Choose moderate in total fat. No longer talking about the low-fat diet. And from 2000 on, you will not see any mention of the low-fat diet. So there's this understanding that, it's okay to eat fats now, maybe a little bit more fats. But they're all these kinds of fats. The unsaturated fats, you're supposed to have fish and polyunsaturated vegetable oils, olive oil, olives should be on this too. But, these are what we're taught are the healthy fats. And so I'm here to talk about the fact that we still have these limits on saturated fats, right? So low-fat diet's gone. Actually, you should also know there are no more caps on dietary cholesterol anymore. All those egg yolks you avoided, egg white omelets, the shellfish you didn't eat because of cholesterol, those caps have also disappeared from any official recommendation. But saturated fat, of those three pillars, fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol, 2 have fallen. And the one remaining one is unsaturated fats. And this is how much they tell you to eat. And these are the 2 main nutrition guidelines that we have in America. American Heart Association, 5 to 6% of your calories a day from saturated fats. That is so low. 13 grams. This is what 13 grams of saturated fat looks like per day. You can have 2 slices of cheddar. You can have, interestingly, you can have more mackerel. Mackerel is higher in saturated fat than steak, which I like to show because everybody just thinks it's just meat and cheese that has saturated fat. But that's it for the day. If you have that 8-ounce steak, you cannot, according to the American Heart Association, have any butter. You can't eat any cheese. You can't have any milk. That's it. That's your allotment for the day. That's not much. So here we are in keto, all having a really high saturated fat diet. And we're routinely told, I'm sure, how many people go to their doctor and they're like, you're killing yourself. Just like Carl was saying, you need to have your carotid artery measured. We eat a lot of saturated fat. So what is the story? Are we killing ourselves? Well, I have to go back and now just review for people who don't know, kind of the basic story of how did we get this idea that saturated fat and cholesterol are bad for health? Many people know this already, but it really did start in the 1950s when there is a rising panic in the country about heart disease. Heart disease had been very rare in the early part of the 20th century, and it had quickly shot up to become the #1 killer in the nation. President Eisenhower himself has a heart attack in 1955, is out of the Oval Office for 10 days. 10 days, that's a long time. So the nation is fixated on this question, what causes heart disease? And people really don't know. There's a number of explanations. It could be, some proposed that it was vitamin deficiency. Other people said it was the type A personality, remember that? If you yell too much, you'll have a heart attack and die. Or auto exhaust. That seems plausible, increasing numbers of cars on the street. Maybe that was having an effect on our health. But we all know this man, Ansel Keys, and it was his idea that saturated fat and cholesterol would raise your blood cholesterol. Oh, go ahead. Would raise your blood cholesterol, and like hot oil down a cold stovepipe would clog your arteries and give you a heart attack. That is the diet heart hypothesis. We all know Ansel Keys was this incredibly forceful, domineering personality. He was able to argue any opponent to the death, and he did that. He got on the American Heart Association committee. This was the only group telling anybody how to eat back then. There was no dietary guidelines. There was no other group. It was only the American Heart Association. And Ansel Keys gets on that committee, the nutrition committee, and whereas in 1960 they were saying, we don't have enough data to give the American public any advice, Ansel Keys gets on the committee, and 1 year later they're saying, avoid saturated fat and cholesterol in order to prevent a heart attack. And that's really the first advice anywhere in the world telling people to limit saturated fat and cholesterol to prevent heart disease. That is the beginning of it all. And what this means in practice is that you're supposed to cut out these foods, and you're supposed to have polyunsaturated vegetable oils instead. Ew. So like some of these trades make sense. Like it kind of makes sense. Like, butter and margarine are sort of parallel, but I have never understood how you give up like pot roast for dinner and replace it with a bowl of vegetable oils. So, and I also just have to review, what were the fats that people have, had eaten and cooked with for millennia before this polyunsaturated vegetable oil idea came along. There were tallow, which is from beef, suet from pigs, from lambs, lard, of course, from pork, and butter. Lard and butter were really the main fats that people cooked and ate in all Western European countries. So, I don't know, this has gotten cut off slightly, but vegetable oils, the idea of expressing oil from a seed or a bean was something that started in the late 1800s, and it was used because the Industrial Revolution was happening, and they had fished out all the whale populations. Whale oil was the dominant oil used in the Industrial Revolution until we killed all the whales. And then they figured, they had figured out how to use cottonseed, how to get oil out of cotton seeds, and they started using that to replace whale oil as industrial lubricants and also to make paints and soaps. And that was the beginning of oils. And then soap maker, Procter, and Gamble, they made soaps and candles, and they looked at cottonseed oil and they figured out how to harden it into this white substance, and they thought, maybe we can convince people that this is a foodstuff. And they decided to market it as Crisco as the replacement for lard. It was going to replace lard in the diet, and they had this brilliant marketing campaign whereby they told American housewives that they should give up the ways of their grandmothers and their spinning wheels and adopt this new modern substance called Crisco. It wasn't made by the ugliness of slaughtering animals. Instead, it was made in shiny, clean labs with silver countertops, and it was new and scientific. And in America, I think Americans uniquely responded to this kind of advertising campaign because, remember, we're a nation of immigrants. Many people are here without their grandmothers, cookbooks without their grandmothers looking over their shoulder in the kitchen saying, "What is that stuff you're cooking with? We don't use that in our house." So we were more open to housewives, with the help of massive marketing campaigns in women's magazines, were more willing and able to adopt this newfangled product, Crisco. And then margarine came to replace butter. That started in the 1930s and 40s, and there were huge campaigns to try to prevent margarine from coming. Margarine was cheaper than butter. And margarine was just another form of hardened vegetable oil with yellow coloring added, just like Crisco. And then they figured out a way to just not harden the oil. You know, oil is very unstable and oxidizes very easily, and so that's why they could not initially sell it simply as an oil. But then in the 1940s, they figured out how to stabilize it enough such that they could sell it as just cooking oil, plain old cooking oil. So this is how vegetable oils come into our economy, and it's always ironic to me, like, that this was considered the solution to heart disease because, you know, they're industrial products. They go through like 16 steps to create vegetable oils. They come out as kind of a gray, sludgy liquid, and then they have to use a chemical compound to create them. A hard chemical, and then they have to deodorize them and winterize them and stabilize them. I mean, it really is a very long industrial process. Why did we think those would be healthier than butter? Also, just in terms of the science and the logic, why would we think, so that red arrow represents President Eisenhower's heart attack. Why would we think that saturated fats were causing it? Saturated fats are falling. Already, while in the trajectory of President Eisenhower's heart attack, what is rising in lockstep with heart disease in the course of the 20th century is vegetable oils. So why would we imagine that would be the cure for heart disease? So the people really didn't pay attention to this science when when Ansel Keys was proposing his hypothesis. And so he was successful in promulgating his idea, and he was on the cover of Time magazine. This is in the same year that the American Heart Association came out with its recommendation. And he's easily the most important nutrition scientist of the 20th century. I mean, his idea, as you know, lives on with us today. So I also just have to explain a little bit about the commercial backing and the involvement of industry in all of this as Ansel Keys' hypothesis was getting started, because one of the questions I always get is, well, what about the food industry and how do they influence? And everybody kind of knows the story now that there were some Harvard scientists in the 1950s who accepted money from the sugar industry, and that's what caused us all to turn our focus away from fat. But actually, it all started much earlier than that. It started back in the 1940s, where the vegetable oil industry realized that if they could get the American Heart Association to back their product, that would be, and get everybody off of saturated fats, that would be a real boon for them. So this is a story that I tell in my book. It's just completely unbelievable, which is that the American Heart Association, which is kind of this sleepy little society of cardiologists, had barely enough money really to pay for office staff, or because remember, heart disease was still new and rare, and so they didn't have much money. And Procter and Gamble, remember, the makers of Crisco, they come along to the American Heart Association and say, we'll make you the beneficiaries of this radio show, which was very popular at the time, and after a week of that, the American Heart Association says, according to their own official history, which now you can't find on the internet, millions of dollars flowed into their coffers. They were transformed into the national powerhouse that they are today. They opened offices all over the country. They're still the biggest nonprofit in all of America. And they, not too long after, there they are, recommending that everybody eat polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which is a product of Procter & Gamble. And there's actually a letter I have of a scientist, one of the top scientists at the American Heart Association, complaining to the then director of the Heart Association, Campbell Moses, saying, I can't believe you're opposing in that ad the movie with a bottle of Crisco oil. I said, that is craven, and if you keep that up, I'm going to have to resign. Some of you will know that letter was written by Fred Kummerow, who did eventually resign. That's a lovely blank slide. Okay, so what was the evidence at the time of this incredibly influential American Heart Association recommendation that set us on the path of believing that saturated fats are bad for health? Well, many of you know this. It was the 7-country study, right? This is a study that Ancel Keys did himself, or led himself. It was in 7 countries, mainly in Europe, but also in the US and Japan, where they went around and sampled the diets and cholesterol levels of nearly 13,000 men, only men, and they followed them and waited to see who died of a heart attack and who died of other deaths, and that study they started doing the work on that study in the 1950s. So this study is like the big bang of nutrition science. Like if you read thousands of papers, as I unfortunately have done in nutrition science, they all telescope back to this 7-country study. It's cited, it's just like, it's one of the most cited papers in the world. And so one of the things that I did and other researchers, like Gary Taub, Zoe Harcum have really taken a very hard critical look at this study because it has been so influential. And I'm just going to review some of the problems we found with it, right? One, I think many people know this, Ancel Keys cherry-picked the studies that he went to. He had done pilot studies where he had gone for the few years around to see what were the eating habits in different countries and where there were high rates of heart disease. And he presented a chart showing, look, here it's total fat, which was his original belief, but fat consumption perfectly correlated with rates of heart disease according to the evidence that he submitted. And these were very close to the countries that he ended up selecting. Here's the total countries that he could have chosen from. So there were countries like France, Switzerland, Germany, where they ate a lot of saturated fats. Think French omelets and cheese and German sausages. And they also had low rates of heart disease. But Ancel Keys did not go to those countries, did not select them. Here's a bunch of populations that we had also been studied where they ate massive amounts of fat and saturated fat and had extremely low rates of heart disease. Ancel Keys knew about a couple of these populations, and he also did not go to those. So it's fair to say that he cherry-picked his evidence. Also, just a couple other small things. He only sampled the dietary data from fewer than 500 men in all of his population, which is not a statistically representative sample. And in the end, in his study, although he did find what he set out to find, which is that people who ate less saturated fats seemed to die at lower rates of heart disease, he could find no difference in total mortality. That means people weren't dying as much from heart disease, but they were dying of something else. So death was the same, regardless of whether or not you ate a lot of saturated fats or a little saturated fats. One other thing that I found about that study in my particular journey through all of its various publications, and let me tell you, some of their publications, it was so obscure the way that Ancel Keys published his data. Some of them were in foreign languages, published like in German, in out-of-the-way publications where you could only think he must be trying to bury his data. So we had to have those publications translated. And one of the things that I found was that these people on Crete who became his star subjects, they were the ones who seemed to eat the least amount of saturated fat, I think around 7% of their calories is saturated fat, and were very long lived. They actually became the men who were the foundation of the Mediterranean diet. But I found out that in one of the three, he visited them, as he did every population, 3 times for a week each. And in one of the weeks when he arrived on the island of Crete, it was during Lent. When they were observing a very strict fast. And so Keys inevitably vastly undercounted the amount of saturated fat these people were eating. So you can imagine how happy, I'm just saying, on the Lent problem, this was a remarkable and troublesome admission. I'm sorry, I don't have a citation for that. That was actually a paper that was published by 2 Greek researchers who went back and looked at the Greek data specifically, and they found the problem of Lent and explored all the ways in which that had an impact on the data and said it was a very troubling omission. And my interview with one of the 7-country studies leaders saying, oops. So you can imagine in all these critiques of the 7-country study that I've done and Gary Taubes has done, well, the 7-country study is, again, this is the hero study for many researchers in the field. When I was in the office of Walter Willett, who's the head of epidemiology at Harvard, and who has been a real champion of Ansel Keys' ideas, there is one photograph on his wall, and that is a picture of him shaking the hand of Ansel Keys. So there was an effort to kind of push back against us and say, well, your critiques are not real. This is something that if you look at the data, it's not for real. And so this is a paper that came out last year that was commissioned by something called the True Health Initiative by these authors. Walter Willett was one of them. He's the one shaking Ansel Keys' hand. David Katz, who's the head of True Health Initiative. And Joel Kahn, and I'll tell you more about these people later. And then this was the writer on the paper who works for Conagra, according to her LinkedIn bio. Conagra is a maker of vegetable oils. So what did their paper say? Well, first of all, they're always very careful in saying that any criticism of them is only done by bloggers and speakers and all those people out there on the internet, as a way of sort of diminishing us. And they say our ideas are kind of faddish and in vogue, they're popular, but they turn out to be untrue, according to them. So what were their criticisms? Well, they wanted to say that Keys did not cherry pick his data, that his selection of countries was fair. And when he cherry-picked, it's not fair to say that he particularly avoided France, and that my critique of Lent is wrong, and that also there was something that I wrote about in my book, which is that then when there was a later analysis of the 7-country study data, it was found that sweets was the category that consumption of sweets was the category that actually most closely correlated with heart disease risk. So they wanted to refute all of those points, which have, been echoed in newspapers and have had a lot of pickup. So is it true? Did we get it wrong? Were we wrong in criticizing the 7-country study? Well, here is their explanation for why they did not cherry pick. We just chose the countries where we wanted to go. And we didn't go to countries where we didn't want to go. Well, that's highly scientific. And that does not convince me that they did not cherry pick. And that's really the best that the white paper could do. Okay, what about the Greek data? Was it invalid due to Lent? They said this was a purposeful choice to go during Lent. No citation given. No methodological protocol cited, nothing. They just say it. And they don't provide any data to show that they did not undercount the amount of saturated fat that was eaten. This is a little bit of a complicated point because they collected data in 2 different ways. They did it with dietary surveys, like food frequency questionnaires, where they asked people what they ate, but they threw out all that data because Keys said it wasn't reliable, which we all know. And they also sampled the actual food that they ate, and they used that data. And that latter data, which was more reliable, does show that they seem to have undercounted saturated fats. Okay, so, and was it true that sweets were found to correlate better with heart disease than animal foods? This is a 1999 study that came out. These are most of the authors of the original 7-country study, and they went back and did this reanalysis. And sure enough, if you look at the data, yes, animal foods, that's the correlation coefficient, 0.821 is higher than 0.798. It's not a big difference, but it's still higher. And And the person who got this wrong was a journalist reporting on my work, and Robert Lustig in Fat Chance also reports on this paper, but we got it right. So anyway, just thought this is the first time I've kind of presented this data just to show you the battle over the 7-country study. It's so important, and how this has played out really over the last year while they're still trying to keep this study alive. I mean, I think the most important point that they really miss in their critique, and the most important critique you can make of the 7-country study with all of its methodological problems, it can only show association and not causation, right? We all know the difference between that. Here's the problem of looking and relying on associations. They can be horribly wrong. Here's this, I just love these charts. They're all over the place. You can find them on horoscopes. If you are Sagittarius, you're at higher risk for stomach cancer. Here's another one. The more you use the internet, the more likely you are to get breast cancer. And it may be true. Maybe it is true that being too close to your computer gives you breast cancer. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's sedentary behavior associated with being at their computer. Here's one more showing decreasing consumption of margarine. Don't do that if you want to avoid divorce and you live in Maine. And this is the same thing as saturated fat. Lower your saturated fat consumption and you won't get a heart attack. Same thing. So scientists, back in the 1960s, scientists really understood that the 7-country study, they understood this point. It's data that only shows association and not causation. So they did make a big effort to get more rigorous data. And this is a little unknown chapter of nutrition science history that Gary Taubes and I uncovered in my book. So governments all around the world really undertook to do a more rigorous kind of science called randomized controlled clinical trials. And that's when you take a group of people like you guys and you put half of these people and you say, you go on the keto diet, and you put all these other people on the vegan diet. Sorry. And then you follow you guys for a year and you see what's the difference between these two groups. And the reason that works is that if I do this randomly, if I assign you randomly, I can assume that you're pretty much, the rest of your characteristics are the same. You're this height, age, weight, all that stuff. So it ends up being the same if you have a large enough population, so you don't have to worry about controlling for those things. Okay, so they did this. They did these large randomized controlled clinical trials on hard endpoints, meaning they followed people until they had a heart attack or died. Death. You cannot dispute death. You can have a lot of arguments over LDL versus HDL versus triglycerides if you only measure a population that far. But once you get to death, no argument. So it's really reliable data. And they did this on more than 75,000 people. So that's a huge number of people. When you hear about a big study in the newspaper today, that's like maybe 150, 200 people is considered a big study. And these experiments lasted a long time, 1 to 12 years. And the results after all that, no effect could be found of saturated fats on cardiovascular or total mortality. Yes, the diets reduced cholesterol, which is a marker that people actually stuck to them. They did not, there was good, decent adherence. This is total cholesterol we're talking about, but it had no effect on the end game of mortality. So why do we not know about these studies? So I'm just going to tell you one example, which is just so it's extraordinary. And this is what happens in science. When I started off my work as a journalist, my father's a scientist, and I thought everybody was like him. Like, I open up his journal that says dreams on the front, and inside are like lists of formulas. And I always thought like science was this rational, but just like my father, rational, progressing ever forward. If you have new observations that don't fit your hypothesis, then you think, oh, I have to change my hypothesis. Maybe I got something wrong. But instead, I found this like the Wild West of studies being suppressed, ignored, data ending up in basements, unpublished, and this is the result of selection bias. So what happened in the field of the diet-heart hypothesis is that there was this tremendous belief in the diet-heart hypothesis by the American Heart Association, the National Institutes of Health, and they just could not accept data to the contrary, right? So we all have selection bias in that we all believe things and we try to ignore the stuff that doesn't agree with our beliefs. That's just sort of human nature. But scientists are really taught to distrust themselves, to try to prove themselves wrong, to try to show that they are not correct. That's the training of science. Selection bias, this is the most incredible example of selection bias that I came across in all of my work, and this is the Minnesota Coronary Survey, which was the biggest ever test of Ansel Keys' hypothesis. It took place it started in the 1960s. It was on some 9,000 men, over 9,000 men and women. It was one of the few experiments that included women. It was in 5 mental hospitals in the state of Minnesota. So it was what's called a well-controlled experiment because they controlled all the food that people were eating. It's not like an experiment where they give people a diet book and say, you know, good luck, maybe an hour of counseling a week. Here they're actually controlling all the food that people are eating. So it's a well-controlled experiment. And this experiment went on for 4.5 years. And at the end of, and just so you know, so half of the people are getting 18% of their calories as saturated fat. Okay, that's almost twice what we're recommended today. So they had regular meat, regular butter, cheese, eggs, cream. That was considered normal in the 60s. And then half the people got 9% saturated fat, which is around what we're recommended today, and they got soy-filled cheese and soy-filled milk and soy-filled burgers or whatever. And they, at the end of that experiment, 4.5 years later, this is what conclusion that they came to, that there was no differences between the two groups. And this is Ivan France, who is one of the study leaders. Actually, Ansel Keys was also one of the study leaders, but he took his name off the final paper. And this paper, actually, they didn't publish it for 17 years, which is kind of cheating in science. You are supposed to publish your results. And when they finally did publish it, they put it in this little out-of-the-way journal that they knew that nutrition scientists didn't read. And when the journalist, Gary Taubes, asked Ivan France in an interview, well, why did you not publish your studies? And he said, well, there was nothing wrong with the results. We were just so disappointed in the way they came out. Which is amazing. And then, not too long ago, it was discovered that they had actually a bunch of unpublished data still on those data reels, and it was languishing in Ivan France's basement, and a team of researchers went and recovered it and recovered the data off of those tapes and did an analysis of it and found that they still hadn't published some of the data, and this is what that data showed. It was published in the BMJ. Yeah. Quite a legacy. So, and this is really not the only story, and I'm not trying to sell my book, but I can tell you that there are stories of studies in the basement of NIH that have never been published. There's quite a few stories like this that were really quite shocking. So that's it. The diet-heart hypothesis is the most tested nutrition hypothesis in the history of the field, and the results were null. No results. And worse, in nearly a dozen of these studies, including these large ones, 3 of them NIH funded, they found that the people eating more the soy-filled cheese and the soy-filled burgers and more vegetable oils, they died at much higher risks of cancer. And that was found consistently in these experiments. And that was of such concern to people at NIH that they had a series of very high-level meetings in the early 1980s, 3 meetings, and Ansel Keys was there, and they discussed, well, what about this side effect of cancer that we're finding? And they really could not explain it. And they said, well, it's just so important to lower everybody's cholesterol. That's just health, public health priority number one. We're just going to ignore the cancer issue. And so they did. And it's been ignored ever since. So this is just my little slide to kind of explain, this is the politics of nutrition science. That's Ansel Keys seated in front on the left, and in the middle is his buddy Jeremiah Stamler, also a long time on the American Heart Association. These are just all the groups that, these are what I call the nutrition aristocrats. And there's still a group like this today. They're very powerful, and they really control the agenda on nutrition, so that they are the ones who, they're the editors at all the major journals, and they review each other's papers, and then so they publish each other's papers, and they're the ones who are on the expert panels at NIH and decide who gets funding and who doesn't get funding, and they're the ones who do the studies. So they very much control the kind of nutrition agenda, and if you are somebody who does not agree with them, if you are a critic, then you find that you are unable to get your papers published, you are unable to get research grants, you are unable to kind of participate, you're unable to be a scientist in your field. So there's a lot of pressure to go along with the nutrition aristocrats. And they have a long history of ignoring science to the contrary. That's one of the ways, we talked about selection bias as one way that you just bury science to the contrary. You can also ignore it. Many people, you know this story about, Vilhelm Stefansson, but he was in the early 1900s, he went off to live with the Inuit in, the Canadian Arctic, and he was an anthropologist, and he discovered that they had very little rates of any kind of diseases, no diabetes, no obesity, no heart disease, no cancer, and he found that they ate a diet of 60-70% fat. And he said the kind of fat they loved the most, they had a kind of ranking of what they loved the most. He said half the year they lived on caribou, and their favorite fat was the fat behind the eye, followed by the fat along the jaw, and then it was the fat on the back, and then on the shoulders, and then the viscera of the animal. And they said, but the tenderloin, which is what we prize so much today, the tenderloin they thought was worthless, and they fed that to the dogs. And this, he published in this book, Not by Bread Alone, and he came back to the United States. Absolutely nobody believed him, so he undertook a year-long experiment with a colleague where they checked themselves into Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and for 1 year they ate only meat and fat and water, and they were supervised by a team of scientists. At the end of that year, they came out with 6 publications. They found the men to be in perfect health despite eating no fruits and vegetables. In fact, in the Arctic, Stefansson had reported that in his book that the only time the Inuit ate vegetables was in times of extreme famine. And he said during this experiment, they were in perfect health and they felt great, except for the time they ate some meat that was too lean, and they started to feel a little nauseous. So they said they quickly cooked up some brains fried in fat, and then they felt much better. But should say, Stefansson wrote a letter to Ansel Keys saying, "These are my findings. This is incredible," and it contradicts some of the the current theories of the day, and he expected to be greeted with open arms, like, "Oh, a new scientific finding," and instead that was the end of Stefansson's career. But now really the evidence is shifting. One thing, there are people today who have gone back and looked at all those studies, the studies on the more than 75,000 people that I've mentioned, and they have analyzed them. There's not just those clinical trials, there's been lots of epidemiological studies that have been done, and there have been independent groups of scientists all over the world who have analyzed that data and come to the conclusion that saturated fats really are not associated with heart disease, and they have no effect on cardiovascular mortality. Oops, I'm running out of time. Okay, well, I'm waiting for the bass to start playing. So this has really had an effect on the world, and you are starting to see some change. These are the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation recommendations showing that they no longer include a percentile limit on saturated fat. There's a big battle just to get this far. The Credit Suisse has said there's going to be a new health paradigm. There's going to be new markets for fat. This is the Lancet giving a real rave review of my book. Which I do put up there not to boast, but to say, if the Lancet is coming up and saying this book is correct, then we know that there is a paradigm shift that is happening at the very top. Thank you. Okay, 5 more minutes. This is the Pure study that came out, the largest. It's the first really, truly global epidemiological study, and it is limited by being only association and not causation, but their finding was that the people who ate the most saturated fat had the lowest risk of stroke. And this is the head of that study saying saturated fat is good for you. He says we got brainwashed by the 7-country study, and this is what he just said at that Zurich conference last month. He says, but we have to get over that. Fiona Godlee, editor-in-chief of the BMJ, who was one of the sponsors of that conference, also came out and said, it looks like we got it wrong on saturated fat. Shouldn't we have a big mea culpa from the scientific community? We're all waiting. But why are experts so reluctant to give up on saturated fats? And I'm just going to run through this really quickly. Okay, one is that no dietary, this is an article that I wrote for the BMJ, and it analyzed the whole 2015 dietary guideline report and all the previous guideline reports since 1980, and it found that no dietary guideline committee, none of the experts making the nutrition policy for our entire nation had ever directly reviewed any of those clinical trials. The government has spent billions of dollars on those trials, and nobody had ever reviewed them or looked at them. Wow. I mean, the NIH funds those trials to inform nutrition policy. And there's no little caveat in there saying, if it doesn't go your way, it's okay to ignore it. So, in response to that, the American Heart Association, which also really should have been reviewing these trials, but never had, they issued this statement last year saying, okay, we're going to go back and look at those trials for the first time in decades when we overlooked them, and we have concluded that they reduce cardiovascular deaths by 30%. That's our conclusion from these trials. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but this is a list of all the reviews that have come out by teams. These are reviews done by teams all over the world on all the clinical trial data on saturated fat. And the important thing is to look at the blue columns. Those are the hard endpoints: mortality, cardiovascular mortality, heart attack, stroke. Those are things that are pretty non-debatable. Everybody who looked at the hard endpoints concluded saturated fats have no effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality, except for Mozafarian here, the second one down, and he's a unique case. At the time, he was on the scientific advisory board of Unilever, one of the biggest vegetable oil manufacturers at the time. But the American Heart Association Presidential Advisory ignores all the hard endpoints and instead goes to like the kind of soft endpoints and says that's where we see an effect. And this is really like if life is like a marathon, you want to know who wins, like who lives the longest. You don't want to know about that's the hard endpoint, right? You don't want to know like who's winning at mile 4. And that's what basically the American Heart Association did. They ignored all the hard data and just looked at the soft data, which they also didn't do very well. All right, so they're also, did I just go off? So they also have started this tactic of, well, saturated fats may be okay, but compared to what? It depends what you replace it with. Well, I find this completely bizarre because, first of all, why this standard for saturated fats? We don't say, are fruits and vegetables healthy compared to what? We don't say, is broccoli healthy compared to bacon? I think I've gone off. Okay, so, we don't use this standard for broccoli. We don't say, is broccoli healthy? Yeah, maybe it's healthy, but compared to what? We only do this for saturated fats. It's like it has to meet a higher bar of evidence. And it's, it makes sense for certain things, like margarine traded for butter. That's a kind of logical trade. But it really doesn't make sense when you're saying, should I eat steak or should I have vegetable oils for dinner? But this is the kind of the game that they played really ever since my book came out. They're saying like, okay, we hear you on saturated fats, but now you've got to pass this higher bar of what do you compare it to? And they've been doing this since about, okay? Sure. Sorry, I'm going over. Sorry, I should say they've been doing this since 2010. And here they discovered this was an invitation-only meeting in Copenhagen that was chaired by Walter Willett and Arne Astrup, and it had that they were going to come up with a consensus statement, and this was their consensus statement. At least it was better. Saturated fats were healthier than carbohydrates, which means you can have steak and eggs for breakfast instead of cereal. But then they continue to say you need to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. These are papers that come almost entirely out of Harvard. They do it through epidemiological modeling, which if you think of epidemiology as uncertain, try doing 2 levels of epidemiological modeling. And they continue to say you need to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And that is pretty much where things stand today. Even in this latest paper by BMJ, which came out just last month. They had this was a special issue that came out in concert with that Zurich conference that happened last month. And this was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. There were actually 4 authors on this paper, but they only put Nida Faruhi's name at the top. And these are the other authors. They're like way down in the acknowledgement section or something. And one of them is Gary Taubes, which is amazing because a lot of us thought, well, maybe he would be able to shift the consensus a little bit, because he's on the paper. And I will tell you that he had a very rough time working on this team. But in the end, they didn't make any progress. It's still saturated fats are better than carbohydrates, but not better in what they now call plant oils. So that was not really a paper that made much progress. Why are they so reluctant to give up on saturated fats? Well, there's this incredible belief in LDL cholesterol as being the most important risk factor. I think many people here know that that is not a reliable risk factor. It does not predict heart attack risk very well. Much better predictor is HDL cholesterol. Everybody know what the only food is that raises your HDL? Saturated fats. But we're stuck with LDL largely because industry figured out a way to lower LDL. Those are the most best-selling drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, and they never figured out how to make a drug that raises HDL. That drug ended up killing people. So there's always been they've always favored LDL as been the favored risk factor or risk marker because they know how to treat it. They have a drug for it. The other really important thing I want to cover is the reason that they cannot let the saturated fats go is that the vegetarians, when we know we are living in a plant-based moment, they understand that saturated fats ever since the 60s have been the rate-limiting factor on meat consumption. It is what keeps meat consumption low. And going back to those people who wrote that 7 countries paper, Walter Willett himself doesn't eat red meat and is an advisor to many vegetarian vegan groups, keynote speaker for a recent vegan conference at Harvard. And if you look at his Mediterranean diet pyramid, what is up in that tip there? You can eat more sweets than red meat, according to Walter Willett. David Katz leads up the True Health Initiative, which is a group that tries to do what science should do, which is to tell everybody we need to think the same. And don't question us. And he's a believer in the plant-based diet.
that's what that group is all about. This is Dr. Khan, who was the author on that white paper about the 7-country study. He's a vegan diet and has a vegan restaurant. Okay, they do not want people eating meat. They've teamed up with the animal rights activists, and they really do not want people eating meat or any kind of animal food, some of them. So saturated fat is what limits our consumption of those foods. Okay, I think and this is Marion Nessel, another defender of the guidelines, saying that saturated fats are basically just a proxy for meat, red meat, which is really not true. If you look at saturated fats and where you find them, they are found, in plant foods as much as animal foods. And many animal foods contain more unsaturated than saturated fats. So I'm not going to go through the rest of these things, why we cannot change the guidelines, except for I think you know all this. Institutional investment, cognitive dissonance, cannot change your mind. 3 generations of scientists saying not to eat saturated fats. The industries that are behind these fats, huge vegetable oil companies, many of whom play a big role in nutrition science. So we're at the end. In sum, Ansel Keys had a hypothesis. It was tested. It was tested more than any other hypothesis in the history of nutrition science, and it could not be shown to be true. So let saturated fats out of jail, is my feeling. All right, I won't go on. All right, I think I've completely run out of time, but I do want to say I do run this group now called the Nutrition Coalition, which we are just fighting for dietary guidelines that are evidence-based, that have a base in rigorous science. And so if you want to learn more about it, that is where we are. Oh my God, there's a typo in there. Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.